En México, matar a un periodista te viene saliendo entre los 5,000 y 40,000 pesos. No es caro.
Ya no hay nada, ya no hay nada.
Bueno, ya no me la... que fui yo.
Ya.
Me quiere bajar la madre a mi mamá.
Y lo seguiré haciendo. Seguiré exhibiendo los rostros y los nombres de los delincuentes.
In the dangerous world of Mexican journalism, threats from cartels are an ever-present danger. But on September 10th, 2023, viewers witnessed something unprecedented, a journalist being threatened live on air. The reporter named Carlos Jiménez bravely aired a video message he received from masked men wielding guns and warning him.
¿Te gusta rascarle los huevos a León? Por eso le rascaste los huevos a León equivocado. Te vamos a cazar como un puto animal, perro.
This chilling incident isn't isolated. For years, journalists in Mexico have faced intimidation, violence, and even death for their work.
Sabemos dónde vives, dónde trabajas, dónde entrenas, dónde comes, dónde vive tu familia, en qué vehículos y motocicletas te mueves. No hay lugar donde te puedas esconder de nosotros.
These words show just how difficult the landscape Mexican journalists have to navigate on a daily basis really is. From 2000 to 2024, a staggering 153 journalists have been killed in Mexico. Each story, each threat, and each life lost paints a picture of a profession under siege. Javier Valdez Cardenas. This first story takes us to Culiacan, Sinaloa, the heart of Mexico's drug trade and home to one of its most notorious cartels. This is where Javier Valdez Cardenas was born in 1967 and where he would ultimately meet his tragic end. To understand Javier's story, we need to understand Culiacan. This city is nestled at the foot of the Sierra Madre Mountains, and it isn't just any Mexican town. It's the epicenter of one of the most famous cartels the world has ever known.
In the Mexican state of Sinaloa, the city of Culiacan sits at the foot of the Sierra Madre Mountains. It's home to the Sinaloa drug cartel and the site of some of the most fierce battles in Mexico's drug wars. Violence has become a way of life here.
We're talking about an organization so vast and powerful that it's hard to imagine ever coming face to face with it.
There is an estimation of the Sinaloa cartel that there's like 100,000 members. That's a fucking army.
Growing up in this environment, Javier saw many of his childhood friends get sucked into the world of drug trafficking, but he chose a different path. Instead of joining the cartels, he decided to expose them. And Javier wasn't just any journalist. He was a man who looked at the violence and corruption around him and decided to fight back with words. After studying sociology in college, he became a reporter and quickly gained a reputation for his fearless coverage of organized crime. Then, in 2003, Javier did something that many would consider suicidal. In a place like Culiacan, he founded his own newspaper, Rio Doce. Starting a newspaper is hard enough, but imagine doing it in a city controlled by one of the world's most powerful drug cartels. It was a bold move, to say the least. Rio Doce quickly became known for its hard-hitting stories. Javier and his team wrote about how drug traffickers and politicians were working together. They named names and exposed secrets that powerful people wanted to keep hidden. In a place where many journalists were too scared to tell the truth, Rio Doce stood out for its courage.
En Rio Doce contamos personas, contar la tragedia que se vive cotidianamente en estas ciudades.
Javier's work went beyond just his newspaper. He also wrote books that went on to gain international recognition. One of his most famous works was Miss Narco, which told the stories of the girlfriends and wives of drug lords. It showed a side of cartel life that most people never see, humanizing the often overlooked women caught up in the drug war. But Javier's brave reporting came at a price. In 2009, someone threw a grenade at the Rio Doce office. Luckily, no one was hurt. But the message was clear. Someone wanted Javier to stop digging for the truth.
Preguntaban que si de quién sospechábamos, nosotros les decíamos que de todos, tanto de los cárteles de la droga como del gobierno, del ejército.
Most people would have taken this as a sign to stop, but not Javier. He kept working, even speaking out more, and that's a pretty brave stance to take, considering Javier knew he was in danger every single day from that point on.
Yo mismo en ocasiones me encuentro revisando y revisando quién viene detrás de mí, viendo los espejos retrovisores del vehículo, quién se estaciona junto a mí. Es un sentimiento cotidiano que llega a enfermarte. Yo padezco insomnio, me levanto en las noches, estoy asomándome a la calle. He tenido que evitar andar con mi familia, procuro andar solo y sobre todo ciertas circunstancias luego de que uno publica un trabajo muy fuerte sobre el narcotráfico.
The toll of living under constant threat is clear in Javier's words. It's not just the physical danger, but the psychological strain of always having to plan in advance and never really feeling safe, even in his own home. But despite these challenges, Javier's work didn't go unnoticed by the international community. In 2011, he won a prestigious award from the Committee to Protect Journalists. In his acceptance speech, he painted a sad picture of his homeland.
La niñez recordará esto como un tiempo de guerra. Tiene su ADN tatuado de balas y fusiles y sangre. Y esta es una forma de asesinar el mañana. Somos homicidas de nuestro propio futuro.
By talking about this on a big stage, Javier was putting himself in even more danger, but he believed that staying quiet wasn't an option. He felt it was his duty to his community and his country to keep reporting, no matter the cost.
Quiero seguir viviendo, quiero seguir respirando. Morir sería dejar de escribir.
Now, Javier didn't know this at the time, but his words would prove tragically prophetic. On May 15th, 2017, Javier's luck ran out. In broad daylight, just a few blocks from his office, he was shot 12 times by unknown gunmen. He was 50 years old. Javier's death sent shockwaves through Mexico's journalism community and beyond. He was the 6th journalist killed in Mexico that year, in what would become one of the deadliest years for reporters in the country's history. And, sadly, the aftermath of Javier's murder was almost as tragic as the act itself. Many journalists became too scared to report on certain topics or name certain people. And this is exactly what the cartels want, because when journalists are too scared to report the truth, these criminal organizations can do whatever they want without anyone knowing. But Javier Valdez Cardenas left behind a powerful legacy. His courage inspired many, and his death reminded everyone of the dangers faced by journalists in Mexico. But perhaps most importantly, his work continues to expose the dark world of cartels, even after he's gone. Miguel Angel Lopez Velasco. While Javier's story is heartbreaking, it's unfortunately not unique. Our next story takes us to Veracruz, another part of Mexico dealing with cartel violence. Here, we meet Miguel Angel Lopez Velasco, a journalist whose story shows us that in the world of reporting on cartels, it's not just the journalists themselves who are in danger. Veracruz, with its strategic location on the Gulf Coast, had become a true battleground for rival cartels fighting over drug trafficking routes. The state was also notorious for its corrupt politicians, many of whom were suspected of having ties to criminal groups, and it was in this dangerous environment that Miguel Angel Lopez Velasco made a name for himself as a fearless journalist, much like Javier before him. Miguel, who wrote under the pen name Milo Vela, was a respected journalist working for the popular daily newspaper Notiver. Like Javier, Miguel was known for his fearless reporting on organized crime and corruption.
Un periodista que generaba un periodismo de investigación muy activo. Él estuvo investigando temas de corrupción, de narcotráfico.
But Veracruz was known as one of the most dangerous states in Mexico for journalists. There was even an unspoken rule in place, basically forbidding journalists from touching certain delicate subjects.
There are definitely issues you cannot address. You cannot address the topic of presidents connected to organized crime. You cannot address the topic of insecurity in the region of the interoceanic corridor.
But Miguel wasn't one to follow any of these so-called rules. He made a name for himself by tackling issues that many of his colleagues were too afraid to touch, and he wrote extensively about crime and security issues, often pointing out how local law enforcement and politicians were failing to deal with the growing cartel problem. Miguel's writing was direct and hard-hitting. He wasn't afraid to name names or point fingers at those he thought were responsible for the worsening security situation in Veracruz. This made him a trusted source of information for the public, but it also put him in the crosshairs of those he was exposing.
Estaba investigando también cómo eran investigados los asesinatos de sus compañeros periodistas, cómo la Fiscalía de Veracruz no estaba haciendo nada por esclarecer los crímenes.
By investigating the lack of progress in solving the murders of other journalists, Miguel was touching on a particularly sensitive topic in that he was essentially calling out the authorities for their failure to protect the press and bring killers to justice. In a place where corruption was rampant, this kind of reporting was extremely dangerous, and the threats against journalists in Veracruz were not subtle either. Cartels and corrupt officials made it clear what would happen to those who dared to speak out.
Si andas de hocicón, se te mocha la lengua. Si andas de dedo, se te mochan los dedos. Si metes la cabeza donde no te llaman, Me tomó mucho la cabeza.
But despite these obvious dangers, Miguel continued his work. Like many journalists in high-risk areas, he probably believed that informing the public was more important than his personal safety. But what Miguel might not have fully realized was that those risks extended beyond just him. But then, on June 20th, 2011, the unthinkable happened. Early in the morning, around 5:30 a.m., gunmen broke into Miguel's home in Veracruz. What happened next was so brutal that it shocked even those used to cartel violence. The attackers didn't just target Miguel, they also killed his wife, Agustina Solana, and their 21-year-old son, Misael Lopez Solana, who had followed in his father's footsteps and was working as a photographer for the same newspaper. All three were shot multiple times, leaving no doubt that this was an intentional and message-sending act.
29 casquillos son los que se encuentran en la escena del crimen y 17 fueron detonados en contra de su cuerpo, 12 hacia su esposa y su hijo.
This horrific act sent a clear message. The cartels were willing to target not just journalists, but their families too. It was a new level of cruelty designed to scare anyone who dared to speak out. The killings of Miguel and his family shocked the journalism community in Veracruz and beyond. It highlighted a disturbing trend in Mexico and other countries where cartels hold power. Journalists weren't just risking their own lives, they were putting their loved ones in danger too. This added an extra layer of fear to an already dangerous job. Now, after the ordeal, many of Miguel's colleagues at Notiver and other local media outlets faced an impossible choice. How could they continue their work, knowing that not just they, but their families could be paid the ultimate price?
Lately, we've fallen victim to criminality, to abuse of power, situations that are beyond our control. As a media worker, I'm very worried.
Some journalists decided to scale back their reporting and avoid topics related to organized crime and corruption, while others even went as far as leaving Veracruz behind entirely. A few brave souls, however, inspired by Miguel's courage, vowed to continue his work, refusing to let the cartels silence them. But the most tragic aspect of Miguel's story is perhaps the lack of justice that followed. The murder of Miguel and his family remains unsolved to this day, like so many other crimes against journalists in Mexico. It's this lack of justice that encourages the cartels to commit even more violence, creating a vicious cycle of violence and silence. The cases of Javier Valdez Cardenas and Miguel Ángel López Velasco are just two examples of the extreme dangers faced by journalists reporting on cartels in Mexico. And their stories end up highlighting not only the bravery of these reporters, but also the ruthlessness of those they seek to expose. Heber Lopez Vázquez. Now, let's talk about Heber Lopez Vázquez, a journalist from Salina Cruz, Mexico. Heber wasn't a big-name reporter, but he was brave. For almost 20 years, he ran small online news sites and used social media to call out corrupt politicians in Oaxaca State. Salina Cruz isn't a place most people have heard of. It's a port city in southern Mexico where life can be tough and dangerous. But for Heber, it was home. It was also the place he felt he needed to protect by exposing the truth. But then, in February 2022, Heber wrote a story that would change everything. He accused a local politician named Arminda Espinosa Cartas of some dirty tricks during her re-election campaign. Heber said Espinosa was forcing companies to threaten their workers to vote for her. This kind of story was typical for Heber. He always tried to show people what was really going on. He believed that if people knew the truth, they could make better choices and maybe even change things for the better. But what he didn't know was that this story would be his last. On February 10th, 2022, Heber was working late in his small radio studio. It was just another night for him, finishing up some reports for his website. His 12-year-old son, Oscar, was with him. Maybe Heber thought having his son around would keep him safe. After all, who would attack a journalist in front of his child? As night fell, a white pickup truck pulled up outside. One man got out and walked into the studio. What happened next was shocking. Gunshots rang out. Heber was killed right there in his studio. Oscar had to hide as his father was murdered. In just a few seconds, a boy lost his father, and Mexico lost another brave journalist. The news of Heber's death spread quickly. He was the 5th journalist killed in Mexico that year, and it was only February. For other reporters in the area, it was a terrifying reminder of the dangers they faced every day. Heber's brother Irving, who is also a journalist, spoke about how scary it was to do this job.
Lately, we've fallen victim to criminality, to abuse power, situations that are beyond our control. As a media worker, I'm very worried.
It's pretty easy to hear the fear in Irving's words. He knew that what happened to his brother could happen to him too. But like many journalists in Mexico, he kept working, hoping that someone would listen and things would change. This time around, the authorities moved fast after Haber's murder. They caught 2 suspects at the scene, and one of them turned out to be the brother of Arminda Espinosa Cartels, the politician Haber had written about. It seemed like a clear connection between Haber's work and his death, but here's where things get frustrating. Even though one of the killers was related to Espinosa, she was never charged with anything, so the investigators essentially found the person who pulled the trigger, but not the one who ordered the hit. Haber's death scared a lot of journalists in the area. Many became afraid to report on certain topics or name certain people, and this is exactly what the bad guys want. When journalists are too scared to tell the truth, criminals can do whatever they want without anyone knowing. It's not just about one journalist being silenced. When someone like Haber is killed, it creates what experts call a silence zone. It's an area where journalists are too afraid to report on certain things. This means that people living there don't get to know what's really going on in their own towns. Think about it. If you lived in Salina Cruz, wouldn't you want to know if a politician was forcing people to vote for them, or if cartels were operating in your neighborhood? When journalists can't report on these things, it's the regular people who suffer. But Haber's story didn't end with his death. His murder sparked outrage among journalists and human rights groups. They demanded justice not just for Haber, but for all the reporters who had been killed for doing their job.
Justicia a la dependencia estatal y federal, porque nosotros los que nos dedicamos a este trabajo tenemos que tener las garantías para poder desenvolvernos. Y nuestro compañero Eber, yo creo que lo que pasó, lo que hicieron frente a sus familias es algo complicado porque no se merecía esto el compañero ni nadie de los que nos dedicamos a esta labor.
Haber's death left a hole in his community. His son lost a father, his readers lost a source of honest news, and Mexico lost another voice for truth. But his story lives on, reminding everyone why journalism matters and why they need all the protection they can get. The threats against journalists in Mexico and other parts of Latin America continue to this day. The recent case of Carlos Jiménez is a horrifying reminder that danger is always just around the corner. On September 10, 2023, Jiménez, a reporter for C4N Alerta, received a chilling video message from masked men wielding guns. But in what can only be described as the ultimate act of bravery, Carlos decided to share that video with his huge audience.
Al principio del programa le mostré un video que llegó ayer a mi teléfono personal, un video donde encapuchados amenazan con asesinato. Se lo voy a mostrar de nueva cuenta, véalo por favor.
The masked men's message was clear and terrifying.
Atención, verguero Carlos Jiménez, te va a cargar tu puta madre. Pon mucha atención, pendejo C4. ¿Te gusta rascarle los huevos al león? No hay lugar donde te puedas esconder de nosotros. Te vamos a cazar como un puto animal, perro. Tenemos tu caja de cartón donde te vamos a mandar en cachitos. Te va a cargar tu chingada madre, pendejo.
Carlos's decision to shine a spotlight on the situations journalists like himself are forced to navigate undoubtedly put him in grave danger. Not only is he not bowing down in the face of the cartels, but he is speaking out against them in the most public way imaginable.
Como le comenté en un inicio, mi labor como reportero es siempre mantenerlo informado y lo seguiré haciendo. Seguiré exhibiendo los rostros y los nombres de los delincuentes. Seguiré exhibiendo a aquellos que le hacen un mal a la sociedad, a aquellos que se sienten impunes, que se creen intocables.
This threat echoes the experiences of journalists like Javier Valdez, Miguel Angel Lopez Velasco, and Anabel Hernandez. It's a reminder that for many reporters in Mexico, the danger isn't just theoretical, it's a daily reality. But just like those who came before him, Jimenez refused to be silenced. This courage in the face of danger is what defines these journalists. They understand the risks, yet they continue their work because they believe in the power of truth. But Carlos Jimenez's story isn't over just yet. The threats he got on TV were just the start. He's still working, but it's scary. The men who threatened him are still out there, and no one knows what they'll do. Will they really try to hurt Carlos, or were they just trying to scare him? Every day Carlos goes to work, he's taking a big risk. Every time he reports a story, he might be putting himself in even more danger. He'll likely always be looking over his shoulder, wondering if today's the day something bad might happen. In Mexico, where cartels and corrupt people have a lot of power, being a journalist like Carlos is really dangerous. We don't know what the future might have in store for Carlos. He might end up hurt like other journalists, or he might keep reporting the truth. Only time will tell. But despite these obvious dangers, journalists just like Carlos Jimenez continue to work, and this casual acceptance of danger speaks volumes about the normalization of threats threats against journalists in Mexico. It's a stark reminder of the daily reality for those committed to uncovering the truth in one of the world's most dangerous countries for the press. And as we've seen, the threats against journalists take many forms, from daily intimidation all the way to brutal murder. But through it all, these reporters continue their work, driven by a belief that people need and deserve to know the truth. The stories we've shared today are just a few examples of the dangers journalists face in Mexico and beyond. From Javier, Miguel, and Heber, who paid the ultimate price, to Carlos, whose fate still hangs in the balance, these brave individuals risk everything to expose the truth. But as cartels and corrupt officials continue to target journalists, one question remains: can the cycle of violence against the press ever be broken? Or are we witnessing the slow death of free media in Mexico? The answer may depend on all of us. If you found this video eye-opening, please hit that like button and subscribe for more in-depth explorations of the cartels. Until next time, stay safe.